Hello and welcome everyone to today's session in the IUBS Centenary Webinar Series. Today our guest is Sara Beery. Hi, I'm Simon Häusler and I'm here for the technical support, and I'm going to guide you through a very few things in the beginning. Please use the Q&A function of Zoom to put in all your questions that will be answered by Sara in the very end of her talk. You can use the function right away while she's still talking. So we have a lot of questions already at the end of her talk. If you find an interesting question, just like it. So we will prioritize the questions in the end. And you can also use the chat box if you have any feedback, questions, any problems also. You can write a text to me. And we will do a quick poll now so we can know where you're joining us from and what your professional occupation is. So please use the poll from now on. And I will hand over to Shashi for an introduction of IUBS and our speaker.
Thank you, Simon. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, the world citizens, and wherever you are, whichever the time zone. Welcome to the 7th webinar of centenary webinar of IUBS, International Union of Biological Sciences. And thank you, Sara Beery, and also Professor Tanya for being here today for discussion on the importance of data analytics using a variety of different methods, and lately artificial intelligence for biodiversity and conservation efforts. In fact, hopefully very soon with these kind of efforts, all our surroundings, not just the background, will be as green as Sara's, the office today. Welcome to all of you, and to particularly our speaker and the moderator. Quickly, IUBS, I'll just share my slides. Oh, I need sharing, Simon.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you should be able now.
Sure, yeah. Quickly, IUBS is one of the oldest unions, science unions, which started in 1999, along with International Union of Pure and Applied Math, Physics, as well as chemistry. The importance of that year 1919, you all know, it was the end of the First World War, and also the beginning of internationalization of science. Einstein's theory of relativity was validated with the help of British scientists working in South Africa during the complete solar eclipse. And that's the year IUBS and many other science unions were established, 2 other science unions established for internationalization of science, and also use science for diplomacy, reduce the conflict, and for peace and harmony in human societies. We have a large number of members across the globe, and both national members as well as international scientific association and societies. And IUBS mainly works in the area of broadly in the area of macrobiology, particularly biodiversity, ecosystem, evolutionary biology, and so forth. And obviously, in the modern days, because all of these are multifactorial phenomena, particularly ecology and biodiversity, data science is being maximum importance. And then we do have a program on big data analytics, and also using a variety of different interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to understand agroforestry, pastoralism, and so forth. And recently, because of the COVID pandemic, we also initiated a working group on zoonotic diseases. And we do have programs on education, both climate change education and education in ecology. And IUBS commits for equal opportunities, gender equity across the globe. And we also work on countries where science is still not fully developed, and try to improve the quality of the science that is done. In the fact that most of those countries also have a fantastic natural biodiversity and conservation and restoration of those areas are very important. So we're bringing all of them together on one platform. And most important, flagship program of IUBS is the Science Policy for Biodiversity is a forum which we organize once in 2 years during the COP CBD, the Biodiversity COP. And the next one is in Colombia on 26th and 27th October 2024. And hopefully we'll come out with some new policy for biodiversity and conservation. In fact, the Montreal CBD, the Declaration of 2030 Biodiversity 2030 policy framework, IUBS played an important role in drafting that. So I'll sort of now introduce our moderator, Professor Tanya Bajaoulf. She's a professor of computer science, electrical engineering, and also director of Translational Data Institution at Ohio State University, a celebrated scientist and an educator, and also promotes data science for again, ecology and biodiversity. She's also the chair of the National Committee of IUBS at US National Academy of Sciences. Tanya, over to you. Thank you very much for being here today with us.
Thank you, Sashi. I want to make sure that I'm not the chair of the US National, I'm member of the ex officio member of the US National Committee of the International Union of Biological Sciences, representing the US National Academies, as the member of the National Academy's Board on Life Sciences. I'm also a shout out to all my departments. I'm professor of computer science and engineering, electrical computer engineering, and evolution, ecology, and organismal biology at the Ohio State University. Probably the most important one here. But with this, I am delighted and excited to introduce our main speaker today, Professor Sara Beery, who is the Homer Bunnell Career Development Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Faculty of Artificial Intelligence and Decision Making in the United States. She was previously visiting researcher at Google, working on large-scale urban forest monitoring as part of the Otter Arborist project. She received her PhD in computing and mathematical sciences at Caltech in 2022, where she was advised by Pietro Perona and awarded the Amory Doctoral Prize for her thesis, which really was focused on this intersection of computer vision, AI, and biodiversity. And her research continues to focus on building computer vision methods that enable global scale environmental and biodiversity monitoring across data modalities, tackling real-world challenges, including geospatial and temporal domain shift, learning from imperfect data, most of it, fine-grained categories, and long-tail distribution. She partners with industry, non-governmental organizations, and government agencies to ensure that her methods are deployed in the wild worldwide. She works towards increasing the diversity and accessibility of academic research in artificial intelligence through interdisciplinary capacity building and education, and has founded the AI for Conservation Slack community and serves the biodiversity community lead for climate change AI, and founded and directs the workshop on computer vision methods for ecology, and co-leads the center that I have the privilege of leading, the National Science Foundation, US National Science Foundation, and Canada and NSERC co-founded Global Climate Center on AI and Biodiversity Change. With that, welcome, Dr. Sara Beery. Thank you so much, Tanya, for the introduction. I'll share my screen.
And while you're doing this and getting set up, I'm just gonna show you the results of our online poll. So a lot of the people, 37% actually, are researchers from academia, some research managers, educators, bachelor, master, and PhD students, a few postdocs as well, 7% from industry, and 13% other. That can also type in the chat box what you're doing if you're interested in. And people are coming, 10% from Africa, 24% from Asia, 21% from Eastern Europe, 18% from North and Central America, and 23% from Western Europe. All right, thanks.
Cool. Thanks so much, Simon. Yeah, so today I thought that
particularly for this audience, which I know is quite a global one, actually very obviously quite a global one, and also quite an interdisciplinary audience across many different dimensions of studying the biological sciences, studying biodiversity, studying ecosystems, and studying the environment, that I would try to speak broadly to what I see as some of the biggest challenges we're currently facing to trying to leverage modern technologies such as AI to expand our understanding of biodiversity at a global scale, and also what I see as the really excellent opportunities for work that will really start to break down some of those barriers. So I think really this conversation starts with data, and often I think many conversations in this space start with data. And particularly from my perspective, one of the things that's really been changing quite rapidly is both the availability in terms of quantity and diversity of biodiversity data. And across really an exceptional breadth of different data modalities. And each of these modalities of data is somewhat limited in some ways and then incredibly beneficial in others. And I really believe that this sort of suite of different types of data, different ways that we're studying the world around us, is really opening up new avenues for understanding. So we look at everything from satellite data, right, which has incredible spatial coverage, and in some cases, our most extensive temporal coverage, but of course is limited in resolution, limited in sort of the perspectives of what you can observe from space. Moving to higher resolution, we look at data from drones that gives us this more detailed picture of life from the air. We look at on-animal sensors. These are ways to understand behavior of individual animals, but of course they're difficult to scale to entire populations. There's extensive work with stationary sensors, large networks of camera traps or bioacoustic sensors that give us this amazing longitudinal picture within a constrained field of view. And then increasingly, we are seeing data collection from the human public, community science or citizen science data, where people are actually going out and actively serving as a data collection mechanism. And these forms of data scale impressively, but of course are much more difficult to constrain in terms of the study design and sort of understanding how to use this opportunistic data in a principled way. And particularly as we look at community science data, we can see that, these scales can be amazing. iNaturalist alone, this is a number from last night, has collected 213 million species observations over close to 500,000 different species. And, as these dimensions of data scale, it becomes very exciting to think about what opportunities this unlocks in terms of understanding the world around us. But one of the things that makes this data so challenging to work with, and one of the things that makes even the study of biodiversity challenging in the first place from a data perspective is that unlike some other measurement problems, things like understanding global temperature change, we don't have a direct sensor for what we're trying to measure. So if you are interested in surface temperature, you can go out and place a temperature sensor in the wild and it will give you a measurement of temperature. If we want to understand biodiversity, first we have to define what it is. And then once we decide on some definition of some dimension of diversity, for example, species richness, then we have to figure out how to measure it. And there is no such thing as a species richness sensor. So all of the data we collect ends up being proxy data. Things like 3D point clouds coming from LiDAR or pixels in an image. These are all sort of different types of digitized but complex data sources that need to then be processed, usually using very hard-won human expertise, into the type of scientific insight that we need to be able to actually move forward in terms of expanding our understanding. And as these amounts of data are scaling, as we're moving to larger and larger amounts of data collected, 200 million images, for example, the human capacity doesn't scale in the same way, and particularly the human expertise doesn't scale in the same way. And so this is really where I posit that AI tools are really necessary. They're a mechanism that enables us to translate these vast and growing amounts of raw data into some form of actionable scientific observation. And this sort of goal, sort of writ large, how do we actually go from data to observation to understanding to decisions, and really looking at change over time is the goal of this AI and Biodiversity Change Global Climate Center that is led by Tanya Berger-Wolf and David Rolnick and another amazing group of PIs worldwide. And, we really are starting to see that AI is able to do a lot of things. It is possible to demonstrate that AI can be used to recognize species in the wild from different types of data, to identify even individuals of a species, with unlocks the ability to estimate populations using marker capture in a non-invasive way, to count large groups, which is very valuable when you're looking at, for example, understanding migratory bird patterns, to analyze behavior in 2 or even sometimes 3 dimensions, looking at explicit biomechanics or species interactions, and to do things like monitor the environment from space. For example, Dynamic World gives us updated weekly maps of things like land cover. And finally, even going to the level of measuring traits, which, for example, is the goal of another large center that Tanya Berger-Wolf runs called Imagomics, that seeks to understand traits at scale from image pixels. And so this is all very exciting. There's so much progress that's been made. And we really are actually seeing this, it's not just in academic publications. These systems are being deployed and they're being actively used and useful for conservation practitioners on the ground, for governmental agencies, for NGOs. So one example of this, a model that I published back in my PhD called the Mega Detector, that helps filter camera trap images and surface images to humans for review that are maybe of most importance. This model is used in 140 countries globally by close to 1,000 different organizations. And one example, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game uses this to help make decisions, active decisions about how they're going to manage their wolf population. They collect around 11 million camera trap images a year. And now with this sort of partnership with this AI model, they only have to review 15% of those, which means that they're actually processing the data in the year it's collected, and they're making their decisions, their management decisions, based on up-to-date data, which previously was impossible. They were sitting on 5 years of unprocessed data because they just didn't have the human capacity to do it. And this is, I think, where we're really starting to see AI shine as a mechanism to help human experts be more efficient in getting to the point where they can make informed decisions. But there are challenges. One big challenge that I see is that taxonomic expertise is limited, and it's something that is sort of broadly bemoaned in the academic community as something that's actually dwindling. The ability to accurately distinguish visually between very, very similar species like this willet and rumbrel, this type of knowledge is hard won, and particularly as you're thinking about scaling up, the number of experts who can really do a good job of verifying the predictions of a machine learning model at this fine-grained scale also becomes limited. And here, one of the opportunities that I see is actually flipping the narrative and using machine learning as a mechanism to teach taxonomic expertise to the community. So this is work by another PI of our global center, Oisin McGay, where he actually looks at developing machine learning methods that assist humans in learning new knowledge effectively. And they've looked at this in the context of both medicine and in things like species identification. I think this is a real opportunity to sort of scale up our community science efforts, both in terms of the knowledge and the data that's being collected. And you can see similar approaches to this from other organizations, things like FathomNet, which is a large-scale effort that seeks to understand life under the water by collecting data through this FathomNet database from experts who are collecting it all over the world, using a portal to help experts analyze that data in participation with AI, and then through this mechanism called Fathomverse, which gamifies the objective of learning to identify underwater species in the community, and then helping that turn into a mechanism for processing that data. And then through human verification, new observations actually get sent through the World Register of Marine Species to be verified by experts and turn into species observation records and taxonomic IDs. So these types of systems are really being deployed, and I think to very impressive effect. And you can see how you can imagine that the number of experts sort of submitting data is much smaller than the number of community members hypothetically in the world that could contribute information or labeling if they had the right expertise to do so. Another big challenge is the fact that data is very imbalanced. And so, this is just looking at a naturalist data actually from a few years ago. And you can see that for some species like the American robin, there are 6 million records. There's lots of different observations of this species from different perspectives and different habitats. And as you go down this sort of long-tailed distribution, there are then many species that are much, much more rare. Things like this wildflower, where there's actually only 16 records. And you can see that actually, as you go to the end of that long tail, there are many that have just a single record. Machine learning models need data to learn, right? This is a big limitation. And if you track the performance of AI systems on this distribution, you'll see it actually matches with the distribution of the data itself. So you'll have better performance for common species and worse performance for rare ones. And this is what we call like the few-shot learning challenge in machine learning. And it's one that's not unique to biological data. This is sort of a universal challenge in machine learning. And it's one that for us is maybe particularly of importance because we care about that long tail. When we're thinking about biodiversity, we care about those rare things, right? We care about the diversity of things that we haven't often seen, or even things that we've never seen before, being able to accurately recognize those. So an opportunity there, I see, is the potential of leveraging modern generative AI, so AI that can actually generate new images, and improving the research in that dimension to maintain morphological fidelity to individual species, and then give us the ability to generate additional training data that is high accuracy, observed by human experts or developed with human experts in the loop to ensure quality, so that we could actually potentially increase our performance on some of these very, very rare species, which are ones that are of high scientific importance. And then another opportunity here is the opportunity for possibly leveraging the crowd, leveraging these community scientists globally to prioritize the collection of real data for underrepresented species through things like bioblitzes, for example, the City Nature Challenge, actually encouraging people or rewarding people for going out and collecting these observations that are particularly useful for building robust machine learning models on those rare species. So another large challenge, and one that's somewhat related to the previous one, is the geospatial and temporal bias of the data that we collect. So we said that machine learning models aren't great at learning things they haven't seen frequently. Imagine how that's exacerbated if you look at, for example, all the species occurrence data in GBIF, and you see that we have these large gaps in terms of where we do and where we don't have data. So in those gaps, we're really in that low data regime. There's many species that we've maybe very rarely seen, and so AI models will not be robust in identifying them. And it's almost anti-correlated where we do have data versus where we estimate we have the most global biodiversity. This is just a rough estimate from a few years ago of global species richness or alpha diversity. And so one opportunity there is actually designing machine learning methods that can adapt to change, making use of places where we have lots of data, and then adapting in a lightweight way to match the distribution and be robust in terms of performance in areas where we have little data or possibly did not have any data before. And this is something we've been developing in my group, particularly in the context of generalizing machine learning performance for detecting and counting and tracking escapement of salmon in rivers, from rivers where we do have training data to rivers that we've not actually seen before in training. And we've actually found that there are ways that we can build our methods that really adapt efficiently and require a lot less human input to get a model that we can trust in a new place, even if we don't have as much data in that place. And then another challenge, one that I think is really limiting, but also very exciting, is the fact that most of the information in the data that we do collect, the data we've already collected, it's been very hard won, isn't labeled. So if you look at this image, this is an image from iNaturalist, and this image is labeled with the species occurrence plains zebra. But you can see there are so many other pieces of information in this data. You can see behavior. There's clearly a fight going on. You could actually identify the individual zebras. You can see that there's zebras interacting with livestock. You can look at the availability of forage on the ground for these different populations. You can look at the health of the trees in the background and their structure. There's so much information captured in these pixels that isn't currently accessible because we just don't have the right systems to make it available to us. And so here, I think there's a huge opportunity for additional scientific discovery from existing databases, particularly through the use of these modern vision language models, large models that humans can interact with via text that enable us to then surface relevant data via images or videos. So here, we've published a method that enables us to query iNaturalist data using open-ended text, something like searching for examples of everted asmaterium, a specific characteristic of some species of caterpillars. And I think this type of more active interaction with the data that we've already collected will really open up avenues for new discovery going forward. And if you want to try this, there's a live demo of these systems that's available on iNaturalist now. And then another, and I think quite important challenge, is that using this technology is expensive. Many of these AI models require access to expensive hardware, either to train them or to just use them during inference time. And this makes these methods and these technologies inaccessible to many potential AI users in biodiversity who come from underrepresented countries, places that are actively developing, or even institutions within wealthy countries that don't have the same access to resources. And so there, I think there's a huge opportunity in the research community to focus on improving smaller AI models instead of doing this arms race to chase for the biggest model we could possibly achieve. An example of that is something like this model that's within the Seek by iNaturalist app, which actually runs directly on a cell phone. It's a very lightweight model that does really accurate species ID for many common species. But of course, anyone who's worked with Seek knows that there's definitely room for improvement. So figuring out how to make these smaller models as accurate as possible, I think is a mechanism of accessibility and equity. And then finally, when we think about sort of these global versus local systems, in Kenya, we don't need to be able to identify bobcats, and in Idaho, we don't need to identify giraffes. And if you're a lepidopterist, you don't need to identify sharks, and if you're an ichthyologist, you don't need to identify moths. So I think there's further opportunity in methods that improve model efficiency through specialization, where you start with some very large scale generalist model, something like a model trained on all of iNaturalist, and then using really lightweight and accessible computational hardware and just a few examples of calibrated images from the case you want your model to work well on, you're able to actually specialize that model even directly in the field on a laptop to your areas of interest and what you're interested in working on. And so when I think about the future of AI and biodiversity, to me, there's really sort of a key set of goals that we want to be reaching for. And the first is that we want the technology to be developed to be accessible, usable, and well communicated. And this can mean a lot of things, but one thing I've been thinking about along these lines is we need better understanding of how, when, and for whom data sharing across different organizations, across countries, across political boundaries actually improves machine learning accuracy and accessibility, so that we can be transparent with organizations who may have concerns about sharing data, about what and when and in what way there is value in that data sharing from a machine learning perspective, and how that may or may not differ from the value in data sharing from a global biodiversity understanding perspective. And treating these two things as identically, I think, is potentially a limitation. So we've been trying to really build up this sense of data valuation. How does a data point contribute in some way to the value of a machine learning model for a downstream task? For example, understanding population size change or distribution change in a given national park for a species. And I also think on this interpretability and accessibility dimension, we really need more interdisciplinary capacity. So along those lines, I've developed this sort of non-traditional education program that I call CV for Ecology, where we try to empower the next generation of ecologists to build scalable AI solutions for global conservation challenges themselves. So we invite senior graduate students, postdocs, even professors in ecology to come and spend 3 weeks writing their own code to build their own AI systems for their own research challenges, trying to really move the capacity to do good applied machine learning and computer vision research into the ecological community instead of having it be this interface back and forth. And what this means is that then we can actively work together on research, right? We can think about what is possible now and what are the ways that we need to improve the methods going forward. And in the meantime, with successful solutions, we're actually able to actively deploy them, and they can be updated and maintained and developed by the community that is using them and needs them. A couple examples of the ways that CV for Ecology students have been developing models. Kara Apple from Oregon State University was developing machine learning models for bioacoustics and camera traps simultaneously across the Pacific Northwest to be able to enable the study of both large and small mammals in partnership with their large-scale spotted owl network. And Chris was looking at the ability to identify species in the background of iNaturalist images. He studies kelp, and very few people go out and actively take photos of kelp just for the sake of kelp, but many people go take photos of fish that have kelp in the background. This is exactly an example of that thing I was mentioning, where potentially the fact that we only have a single species label per image is limiting. And so Chris was actually able to massively upscale the number of occurrence records that they had for kelp in the reefs he's studying by building models that could identify kelp in the background of images of fish. So another thing that I think is really exciting, we're thinking about the future of AI and biodiversity, is thinking about systems that are designed specifically to support decision-making across scales. So not just looking at the accuracy of the model, but actually looking at how it informs the decisions that we make or the actions that we take. And one explicit trade-off that we see is that often global scale models are kind of locally insufficient. So this is a really great work by Nico Lang et al., where they built a global map of tree canopy height using JEDI data. And the availability or the ability to make sort of global scale decisions about carbon sequestration and biomass from these global models of tree canopy height is incredible. But if you actually want to then think about what actions you should take or impact assessment or measurement within the context of a specific county or a specific national park, what you find is like looking here at the difference between the models themselves and the standard deviation of the models. You can see that there's a lot of variance depending on where you are on Earth. These models are more accurate some places than others. And so I think we need mechanisms that actually help us figure out how to specialize these global models to local scales so that they can actually also support local decision-making in a useful and practical way. And finally, I think it's exciting to think about systems that could be potentially strategically multimodal. So explicitly build systems where we can actually inform users about how to collect the data they need to maximally observe maybe their system of interest, right? If you want to understand the entire sort of taxonomic tree within the context of a given city or a given state, what's the right set of sensors you should deploy? What studies should you build? What should you design? What data do we need? And what's going to sort of maximally reduce our uncertainty in these measurements? And this type of active and sort of targeted data collection informed by AI, I think is a really exciting path forward. And really there, I think, we're seeing that we have access to many of these sensor types, but being able to actually study them simultaneously and do experimental design where we are explicitly removing or providing access or exploring the mutual information across the modalities, I think is really exciting when we think about how we can actively and efficiently allocate our limited resources for the future. Where do we need to understand? What do we need to understand? And what is the best way to do it that maximizes the impact that we can have? Cool. So thanks so much. I hope this was, a pretty broad strokes overview, but I'm excited to potentially discuss with the panel. And I just wanted to flag a few possible avenues for continuing the conversation as well. So like I mentioned, we have the CV for Ecology program. If you're interested to learn how to build AI models for your own research projects, you can take a look at our website. We're going into the next one now, but we'll have applications for the following cycle in the spring. We also have an AI for Conservation Slack channel that's a really wonderful and active and engaged community, helping people debug and inform best practices around developing AI for these problems. And you can get an invitation by emailing that email. There's about 2,500 global researchers on that channel. And it's been a really amazing resource, I think, for our community. And finally, just recently we did for the first time a large scale overview of the different research groups at the intersection of AI and biodiversity and ecology globally. And so there's a YouTube playlist that you can check out if you're interested in potentially studying or doing a PhD in this area and finding out about the different PIs and the different research groups that are kind of growing worldwide with this explicit focus. Cool. So with that, I think I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Sarah, for this wonderful presentation, like really a blitz overview of the state of AI in biodiversity data mostly, and you particularly focused on image data, on visual data and that modality. So you mentioned multimodal several times, and you also mentioned the sensors that we use to collect data about world's biodiversity that go way beyond the visuals, the kind of visual type of data. And there are questions that are coming up from the audience about that are related to these two different notions of multimodality, and particularly how can we incorporate other modalities of data beyond visuals. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the examples I showed were image specific. I think that fundamentally, depending on the structure of the data you have, a lot of the actual methodology is somewhat shared. So for example, if you're working with bioacoustics, many of the state-of-the-art approaches for working with bioacoustic data first translate bioacoustic wave signals into something like a sonogram, and then they take that and they run it through a computer vision algorithm. So it's a way to sort of similarly extract representations and understanding from other modalities of data, but actually through these mechanisms that are quite flexible and robust. Similarly, you know, we increasingly work a lot with another pretty common modality, which is text. And the methods we use to work with text are the same in many ways as the methods we use to work with images. We use transformer algorithms, which, though the way we process the data into that algorithm in the first place does need to be carefully designed, the underlying sort of flexible system for learning relationships and complex higher order and nonlinear relationships between these different types of features, those can be shared. I think where it gets really interesting is when we start thinking about types of data that aren't easily digitized. Things like hard-won, generations-long cultural knowledge of the people who live in a place. We often don't have simple mechanisms for sort of turning these into like easily digestible data points that can be used in machine learning algorithms. And thinking about how these knowledge systems, either sort of more formalized scientific knowledge systems or these very sort of complex and interesting and valuable local knowledge systems can be brought together with AI, I think is a really exciting path forward as well.
Thank you for that. That's a really, really good point about local knowledge and community and knowledge that's currently not really well being incorporated at all, almost into any of these large-scale systems. I want to follow up a little bit specifically on the eDNA, leveraging eDNA, and if you want to take that one.
Yeah, so like I said, I think a lot of these different types of data, it often comes down to what the structure is. So DNA is a sequence, text is a sequence. You can think of images as a sequence. And so these transformer models are sequence to sequence models. And so actually, when you look at the modern methods in AI for working with DNA, they're actually very similar at their core to the models that we use to work on images. And I think the interesting thing becomes, for DNA in particular, what information it captures for us, right? Because I think there's still so much to understand about if you find the presence of, well, I guess that's more metabarcoding, but if you find the presence of a species in DNA, what does that mean about the presence of that species in that place? Has it sort of moved there through a water current, or is it in the air and transmitting, or is it sort of was eaten by something a continent away, a migratory bird, and then was sort of defecated in that place? And so these understanding of like how we translate the presence of DNA to the presence of a species, I think is quite interesting to try to understand. eDNA more generally, and similarly to like, I would say like the sort of broad scale ecoacoustics, where we're not trying to identify individual species, we're just trying to look at variance or relative change across a signal, I think is also a really interesting component and something that there's probably a lot of potential in further exploration.
Yes, absolutely. And that actually brings up another question that was asked from the audience on leveraging leveraging additional data modalities such as habitat and abiotic factors for understanding species distribution across spatial scales, and how that can be added to AI models, but more importantly, how can AI maybe help understand species distribution and differences, especially in the changes, the changes in the species distribution with the changes in climate and other factors.
Yeah, so one of the things that's very interesting is where you want to use this information. So if you incorporate information on the habitat and on sort of a bunch of these environmental characteristics into your machine learning training to identify species, then you want to actually use the species distribution model you're going to sort of develop from that data to then further understand the relationship between these things. It gets a little bit messy. You're sort of like teaching to the test, or like maybe specifically biasing the thing you understand to match the relationships you've already seen. That's like a sort of vague way to try to say this, but essentially, if we want to use this environmental data, we can either use it to be more predictive, which is essentially like building strong priors on where and when and in what way species are likely to be seen, and then get better and more accurate predictions of those species from different modalities of data. Or we can try to model the species themselves independently of that, and then on the back half, try to understand the relationships between those species and the environmental factors and how those are changing over time. And we have to be careful about what information we provide to the machine learning model at what sort of point in the system, so we make sure that we're sort of designing these effectively, and we're not accidentally sort of begging our own hypothesis in the analysis. And I think one really interesting thing is we've found that we can build really strong priors on the co-occurrence of species, or on the relationships between species and the environment. We can build these 10,000 way multi-species kind of spatially explicit models, or just something like a species distribution model. And they can be really valuable. But one of the challenges is those models are learned from historic data. And so almost by default, there's this potential to suppress our ability to recognize when those ranges are shifting, right? Because if we're using this prior to improve our understanding, then we actually have to be very careful about how it might impact our future predictions, given that it's learned on historic data.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this notion of we really need to carefully understand why are we using this data, why are we training the models, so that we accidentally don't train on the answers we're trying to get. But the other aspect of it is also, and you've alluded to it during the talk, and I know that you've put a lot of thought into it, is really being careful about what is it that we're trying to answer, right? What is the question that we're trying to understand from the biological perspective? And not getting, because typically we have this long pipeline of several machine learning approaches. It's not one model that takes us from data to the answer to that question. And quite often, the different biases in the data and the different sort of combinations and compositions of the models lead to either drastic differences in the final answer or nothing at all, right? We can improve the accuracy of the intermediate models by 20%, which doesn't absolutely make a difference in the final answer, and particularly decision-making for policy, or assessing the impact of interventions, or understanding the biodiversity drivers. So how do we think about that and really balance the desire to improve the machine learning methods and the newest shiny thing with a really with a focus on delivering tools for biodiversity decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's something I've definitely been grappling with a lot in recent years. I think, one of the most important dimensions of all of this is the way that we evaluate these systems, and thinking very carefully about what data we need in what places on Earth for what species, and how we are going to measure the performance of a system so that it's aligned with the goals that we have, is something that takes a lot of careful design and often careful interdisciplinary sort of coordinated conversation about, what is the goal of the user? What is the decision they need to make? What is kind of the action space that they could take? And then what is maybe most informative? And I think this is something we've done very badly so far. In machine learning, we have this idea of benchmarking model performance. It's something that's much less common in other fields, where you sort of define some set of data sets where you have maybe training data and evaluation data, and you can use these data sets to systematically measure comparative performance across different potential methods or different potential systems. And this is an amazing resource for making progress, as long as those benchmarks are designed to be well aligned with the thing that actually matters, right? But often what we found is that the benchmarks are aligned with something like predictive accuracy on single data points, which we've realized in practice is often very far removed from, say you have a model and you improve predictive accuracy on identifications of individual species in camera trap data. Is that aligned with or monotonically increasing at the same way as if you're looking at an occupancy model downstream, or you're looking at a species distribution model, or you're looking at some other ecological measure? It turns out that the same sort of improvements in the machine learning model won't necessarily improve all three of those in the same way. And so like the task that you're actually going to use downstream should be kind of a component of the evaluation of this machine learning component of the system. But beyond that, changes in your occupancy model often are also not necessarily aligned, or improvements in your occupancy model aren't sort of universally aligned with changes in your decision making, right? So if your occupancy model changes in one way, is that going to actually change your management strategy? And so I think it's quite difficult to do, but I think one of the things that we really need to come together and do across these disciplinary boundaries is come up with mechanisms for understanding how to go from end to end in terms of evaluating the systems we're building. What is important? How do we prioritize and kind of optimize for what's important, given the diversity of downstream things that we might be interested in?
Yes, and particularly when we talk about things like indicators, right? Like these massively summarized indicators that governments and then localities are required to report. We really, maybe accuracy on any particular species identification in one camera trap is not the answer, but systemic bias may be. So with that, nothing is 100% accurate. And ultimately, all of these tools are just tools that need to be used by humans for decision making, for insight. And so you've mentioned in your talk already that really the way to think about all of AI in any context, and particularly in this one, where ultimately the work is done by people in the field, a lot of it. And so how do we build these systems for human-machine partnership? Right? You've shown a couple of examples. And the specific question that has come up, sort of two aspects of it that have come up in the questions that we have. One is, how do we ensure that there is trust in these tools by the people for whom they are intended? And that is related, but not quite, also to how do we provide the necessary understanding and skill set, not only just to scientists or future scientists who can take the CV for ecology course, but to decision makers who have to use, if not the tools themselves, then the outcomes of these tools. So how do we both foster this trust in the tools and then the enough understanding to use these tools?
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful question. And I think I would actually say it's interesting. It depends on the type of tool and sort of like who's working on it, but I've actually seen almost more of the opposite. I would say sometimes I've seen too much trust in these models. People get this, they see the AI hype. They think that machine learning is this like magic wand and that it sort of just works off the shelf for anything you might want it to work for. And actually there's a lot of work involved, right? Like it takes really careful and almost sort of scientifically designed mechanisms to kind of bring together the data you need, make the right choices about training, get out a result. Now, if that's done carefully, we do see really amazing impact of the deployment of these models, right? I mean, and just massive scale up in terms of human capacity to kind of process and work with and kind of get analysis out of their data. There was a paper recently that cited that they were, sorry, they were recovering old. There was a paper recently that said that they were seeing an 800 times speed up in their ability to process their camera trap data using machine learning. And in a really like nice systematic way. This wasn't overhyped. This was very carefully measured. But I think a huge part of that trust is actually in providing the means for evaluation to the user, right? No one should just sort of take a machine learning model and use it without probing it. But making it easy for a given hypothetical user of a machine learning tool to understand how to evaluate it in the context of the problem they care about, what is important, how do I sort of test this model for my use case and build an understanding for where it should be trusted and maybe where that we need to design that human AI partnership, what types of decisions the machine learning model makes that we should actually automatically send for human verification. And that type of almost like calibration of the system in a local context, I think is something that does require a lot of capacity and intuition. It doesn't mean that you need to be, programming the system end to end yourself, but it does mean that you need to have the right sort of mindset or the right intuition about the types of skepticism that you should have and like how to understand when something is working well and when it is reliable. And I think it's important for people to know that that does change depending on where you are and what you want to use the model for. And so I think a lot about how do we build that intuition, right? How do we teach people like what's hype and what isn't? And I've been working a bit with Wild Labs and also with you, Tanya, and thinking about how do we build training materials around AI intuition, right? How do we sort of teach executives who will never be designing these systems or even maybe never be using these systems themselves, but need to be making decisions about whether they should invest in AI tools or not for their organization? How do we help them understand what's a good use of AI right now, well vetted, kind of ready for deployment, and what's potentially highly risky? And I think that type of knowledge is something that can be really valuable. And it's one of the things we teach in this CV for Ecology course. And all those materials are public. So, I mean, of course, they might be at a bit more of a high scientific level, but I think things like that more for a general public or more for just like the end user audience, in national parks on the ground, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, this is a complex, and I know that we've had many discussions about it. I want to just very specifically reiterate mention of a community that you already mentioned of wildlabs.net, which is the Tech for Conservation community, global community that really is a forum, an online forum that can take NGOs, particularly, small organizations, individual at locations where maybe direct access to experts is not available, to provide this online access and expertise sharing, specifically not at the research level, but way down the translational path of implementation and deployment, everything from what is the right setting for my camera trap, how do I process this data, what's available off the shelf, and what are the assumptions, how do I actually set it up and do it. And so there's a lot of that information sharing in this wonderful community. So the flip side of using technology in particularly this context of biodiversity is something that comes up quite often is the impact of technology itself on biodiversity. And this is not just, there's quite different aspects of it. The impact of bringing of bringing camera traps or other sensors to deploy them in areas where humans maybe have not gone quite often before. You have to, deliver, not only bring, cars have to quite often get there, or humans on track, but also you need to some way, a little, whether it's solar panels or whatever else. Drones quite often are worried about in terms of the impact on wildlife, although they're probably less disruptive than many other technologies that we have. And certainly AI itself, in and of itself, is a huge, has non-trivial environmental impact. And both in the hardware sort of rare metals that go into it to build the AI necessary hardware, the energy, the water, all of the above, and particularly for the new type of AI, the generative AI, that really is where environmental concern is. So can you talk a little bit about the impact of technology itself on biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important point, and it's one that I kind of grapple with myself as well, right? If I'm sort of using carbon to try to protect the environment, like what's the trade-off? The first thing I do want to remark on is specifically what you talked about at the end. Not all AI is equal in terms of its impact, and actually the biggest driver in terms of the environmental impact of training a machine learning model is not anything about the model itself. It's all comes down to what data center were the GPUs in that were training the model, and what's the power and water and like sources for that data center. And we've seen some really nice systematic studies that have come out of the community that are showing sort of if you invest in your GPUs being at data centers that are powered more renewably, the environmental impact of them is catastrophically less than ones that are not. So it's nuanced, right? It's not just a bigger model is always worse. It really has a lot of relationships to these many complex factors. And a lot of what I'm talking about, a lot of the models we've been sort of training and deploying, they're small on purpose, right? Because they need to be accessible within the constraints of really, really resource limited environments, right? We need to be able to train and use the models in the field, in the remote Arctic, underwater, in ways that we really can't rely on access to, thousands of parallelized GPUs and really large scale memory systems. And so the environmental impact of these small AI models, which I think represents the vast majority of the way that people are doing kind of biodiversity AI, at least currently, is much, much less than something like ChatGPT. That said, we're really starting to see that some of those very large scale models that are being published by these big companies and do cost on the order of, $30 million to train and massive amounts of sort of carbon in a way. Those are beneficial for biodiversity as well. They can be, right? This type of like open-ended text-based query, that it can be a powerful tool. And so in my mind, I want us to try to figure out how to make those models more efficiently. I want efficiency and sort of like impact of those models to be a primary concern of big companies, but also if they've already been trained for a commercial use, I don't want us not to like try to leverage that power for these important problems, right? It's like we've already paid the cost. Let's try to see the benefit.
Thank you very much with that. We have come to the end of this wonderful webinar and the end of this conversation. There are many, many, many more questions. The webinar will be available for recording, and I hope that the conversation will continue not only here, but also more globally to other platforms. Thank you, IUBS, for inviting and for starting this conversation.
Yeah, it's been an honor. Thank you so much, Tanya, for the discussion, and for everyone at IUBS for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fantastic, talk and the discussions. I'm sure many of these models would be very useful for almost in the immediate term for conservation purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara and Tanya. The recording will be online. I put the YouTube channel in the chat box. I'll upload it as soon as possible.